to the Dan Cordes Show. South Africa is a movie.
Welcome to the watch party!
Very good. Now, for tale as old as time, South Africans have been worried about and fighting about whether or not government should solve our issues or whether government is so incompetent and dysfunctional that we should let the private sector take over key resources like maybe education, maybe healthcare, maybe transport, telecommunications, electricity and water. And there's this constant battle happening with this belief that the private sector has got us covered way more effectively than government does, even though it's the private sector that at least in part has not been making enough jobs or creating enough work for many South Africans to be able to live, work and function and afford their lives well. It is a mutual relationship that creates the country that we have between the private and the public sector. But maybe putting aside Steinhoff, the big Steinhoff scandal, a lot of South Africans don't have a proper or good sense of who owns South Africa, who owns our biggest companies and biggest businesses. Are there certain billionaires and multinationals who own huge stakes in many businesses, from private healthcare to mining to agriculture to cars and the rest? And so the wonderful people at Open Secrets, which is a fantastic research, investigations and advocacy organization mainly based in Cape Town, they have started a new series of their own investigations called Who Owns South Africa? And I think it's incredibly important that we find out. Please welcome, having flown here from Cape Town just to be here for little old us, from Open Secrets, Michael Marchant is here, everybody. And it's so interesting because we've been having a totally justified wobble as a country about Tembisa Hospital and public health care. And then I think the day after the SIU made their announcement, or the same day, you guys released who owns private healthcare, and with the NHI going on and everything. But let's start at the start. Open Secrets does a lot of different investigative work. Why did you guys want to find out who owns South Africa? What a great question, by the way.
Thanks, Dan. I think it's primarily two reasons. One of them is quite selfish, which is that Open Secrets, we investigate economic crime by the powerful and especially the private sector. And we do it across different sectors. So, one day we're looking at private hospitals, the next day we're looking at the arms sector, we look at the banks. And every time we start an investigation, we have to answer the question ourselves, who should we look at here? Like, who has that power, right? Who's the biggest player in the sector? And how do their decisions kind of shape that sector? So we wanted to do that. But the other part goes to what you've been saying in your introduction, is that we wanted to contribute to the debate about why does South Africa's economy look the way it does? And we would argue that South Africa's economy does work, but for an incredibly narrow group of people. So if you look at the news today, JSE is at an all-time high, profits are high. Last week, Shoprite's executives gave themselves a 110 million rand bonus because, things were going so well. But unemployment... I don't know if you just heard the sigh from the audience there. That was like palpable. Sorry, yes. Exactly. And I think this is how a lot of South Africans are feeling, is that...
Because, sorry, as you were saying, unemployment is at a world record high. Things are terrible.
Unemployment about 35%, and that's the national average. If you go into places like Mpumalanga and other provinces, 1 in every second person doesn't have a job. And for many people who are lucky enough, if you want to put it that way, to have a job, let's say you are, for example, someone who works as a cashier at a retailer like Pick n Pay and Shoprite, you almost certainly don't earn what we would consider a living wage. And yet, of course, for the shareholders of many of those companies and the executives, things are often working out quite well. And so we wanted to answer a little bit of that question, and we wanted to broaden the answer beyond the state. Not to say that the state is not important and its failings are not important. They absolutely are. The levels of corruption, for example, are hugely detrimental. But if we ignore, I think, the extent of the power that private actors have, the extent of the control that they enjoy over the economy and the impact of the decisions that they make, we are only answering half the question, and we are only then looking at half of the solutions.
I fully understand why South Africans are righteously outraged and probably should be more angry about how much is looted from the state. But why is, and I've asked other people about this on this show, why is it that when it's like a private sector business crime, does it get so much less media attention? Is it because, like Steinhoff, you can acknowledge that it's terrible, but if you didn't lose money in the Steinhoff saga, you don't feel less as affected, whereas if the state fails, the government fails, it's supposed to be helping all of us?
At Open Secrets, we ask ourselves this very often in our everyday work in the office, like, what's going on? And I'm not sure I have a single answer, but I think what you've said, there's a couple of different things that are going on. The one is that private sector actors, particularly large corporations, are exceptionally good from a PR perspective at kind of persuading everyone that, first of all, their conduct has less impact, but also too many people just accept the fact that we should hold them to a different standard. Often people look at large executives and corporations and say, well, they're profit-seeking entities, so they'll kind of do whatever they want, and we should let them get off the hook, which I think is hugely problematic. But I think another part of the story is that so much of what they engage in is quite difficult to understand and difficult to pin down.
Right.
And so when we look at, for example, the Tembisa hospital scandal, we now in South Africa understand tender corruption so well.
That we get it.
That we get it. We can plug in and we say, we understand how the syndicate works, we understand how the contracts are given. When it comes, for example, to how corporations routinely lie on their invoices or cheat on their tax, we often don't exactly know how they're doing that. And it operates in the shadows. And maybe the last thing I'd say, and this is something we speak about at Open Secrets a lot, is that the work of the private sector, even when it verges on the criminal, is legitimized by their private sector friends very often.
Right.
So they're relying on accountants, lawyers, management consultants, who often work to smooth over the edges to enable their conduct. And so I think it's maybe a combination of all of those things of why we don't look at them enough.
Okay, so let's get on to who owns South Africa. You guys released your first kind of big thing. Was it at the end of September, just on the cusp? And your first kind of installment was The System. What did you guys discover in your investigations, and how did you kind of, what did you lay out?
So in The System, the short answer to who owns South Africa, if you want the short one, is that it's a very small group of people.
Okay.
Right? So there's a few things that we look at in there. You know, the stat that I think has always stuck out to me is that there's 3,500 South Africans who own 15% of the country's total wealth.
Wow.
That's a very small group of people. Wow. You get even smaller than that. There are $6 billionaires in South Africa that collective wealth was about 555 billion rand for those 6 people.
Yeah.
That was at the time of print about 2 months ago. That's already around about 600 billion in terms of how that has grown so considerably.
And these are South African dollar billionaires who own enormous stakes in a lot of different South African industries.
Absolutely. And of course, it is a combination of people, but it is predominantly people who have accumulated their wealth over long periods of time, including during apartheid. So the 2 people far and away ahead of that list, Johan Rupert and the Oppenheimer family, exert unbelievable amounts of control across our economy. It's partly a function of how much they accumulated during apartheid, but I think one of the things we speak about in The System is how democratic South Africa was not at all disruptive to the economic interests that had been built up over that time.
Right.
And so what has happened slowly but surely is that those incredibly wealthy individuals and the conglomerates that they own have started to have accumulated shares in different parts of the economy. So, you know, for the everyday person, often, you know, we're not aware of it, but often you would go out, maybe you go to a doctor one day, then the next day you have a cell phone contract, then you are, you know, going shopping, etc. You very well may be paying into a system that's paying exactly the same shareholder because, for example, you know, Johan Rupert's company Remgro, shareholdings across the economy, right? So they benefit, I guess, a little bit everywhere. The other fundamental thing that we speak about in the System chapter, and we think it's incredibly important, is we talk about the financialization of South Africa's economy. And really, you know, put simply, what that means is it's the growing importance of finance across South Africa's economy. So in the late apartheid period, it was the mining sector and the energy sector that was about a quarter of South Africa's economy. That's swapped round. It's now a quarter that is accounted for by the banks, finance, insurance, and real estate, the so-called FIRE sectors.
Why are they called that?
No, that's just the acronym.
So, sorry,
So
FIRE.
FIRE,
Yes, I
right?
get it.
F-I-R-E.
I was like, are they burning us to the ground?
Well, I mean, it's actually, it's not a terrible acronym.
It's fitting.
In that sense. It's quite fitting because, I mean, what we argue is that the growth of finance means that more and more of our economy is just geared towards financial outcomes.
Right.
You mentioned in the intro, right? Our economy doesn't create jobs. Part of the reason for that is that almost all excess money that's generated out of South Africa's economy is invested in financial products. It doesn't go back to paying people fair wages.
Building factories.
And it doesn't go back to building factories and building industries that are job creating. It also means that even non-financial companies are increasingly financialized and selling financial products.
Okay.
So again, to use a concrete example, has anyone, you'll increasingly realize that when you go to a shopping center, why are all the retailers constantly trying to sell you financial products? They want to sell you insurance. They want to give you a credit card. When you get a SIM card for your cell phone, again, they want to bring you into a financial system. And I think that has increasingly grown to kind of dominate South Africa's economy, with very serious consequences for how that economy is shaped.
Okay, so that's how you see, and Open Secrets has seen the system working. If this is not too much to ask off the top of your head, beyond the Johan Rupert and the Oppenheimers, who are the other four of like the big six that own, I think you said 15% of our economy?
So there's a few others that are really important. Of course, Koos Bekker of the Naspers empire. We spoke a little bit about media, and there'll be an installment of Who Owns South African Media coming up likely next year. Patrice Motsepe, another name.
African Rainbow
Capital, of course, connected to the president and the political elite.
Not just connected, in-laws.
Yes, in-laws.
Let's call it what it is.
Dynastic, right?
Yeah.
And also, I mean, just to pause there, the other point about the system, I suppose, is that Patrice Motsepe and Cyril Ramaphosa are perfect examples, I think, of how a democratic South African government didn't look at the economic structure and say, let's fundamentally change this. They said, how can we get some different people at the table?
I see.
And so, I mean, this has, of course, been documented by many people before Open Secrets, but how the state has been repurposed, but also a few individuals have benefited immensely, and the kind of structure hasn't changed. The other two, of course, Christo Wiese, famously involved momentarily, was not a dollar billionaire because of Steinhoff, because he'd also been robbed by Marcus Jooste, along with a few other people. And then Michiel Leroux, who's the CEO of Capitec. So those are the individuals.
Some other members of that big six who you mentioned made a hell of a lot of money during apartheid and then struck some lovely deals, allegedly, again, with the African National Congress leadership in the mid-90s to preserve and extend power. This is great. It almost feels naughty to be talking about this on TV in the open in front of everybody. But Michael, last week, as we all were shocked and appalled if we hadn't yet read all the extensive investigative reporting from Jeff Wicks and others about Tembisa Hospital and about the public healthcare disaster of 2 billion rand and more being ransacked from one hospital, you guys released part 2 of Open Secrets' Who Owns South Africa into private healthcare, which is something that a lot of people see as the sign that you can survive properly in South Africa if you can get some private healthcare, but also has come under serious fights recently because of the National Health Insurance Initiative by the ANC. What did you guys learn about, and then tell us about private healthcare?
What we find when we look at the private healthcare system is exactly what we find in the system, is that it is always a very small group of actors that are dominating the healthcare system. So there's really two sectors that we need to think about, and anyone who is, I think we would say, lucky enough to have medical aid and access will know that when you're looking at private hospitals, you don't have many options. It's essentially Mediclinic, Netcare, or Life. Those three hospital groups account for about 87% of all private hospital admissions.
Really? Wow, okay.
And of course, because of the national footprint as well, they have huge power to dictate prices.
Life, Mediclinic, and Netcare.
And Netcare.
Account for 87% of all private healthcare walk-ins.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think 85% of all beds are those three hospital groups.
Wow.
Gives them extraordinary market power. They can dictate prices, and they can also dictate prices to the medical aid companies. And of course, on the medical aid side, you have a very similar concentration. You're really looking at Discovery, which is by far and away the biggest. You're then looking at MedScheme, which is the administrator behind schemes like Bonitas, which people would know. And so you're looking at this kind of very small group of actors. On the medical scheme side, it's really important to remember, anyone who's watching tonight who might be thinking, oh, you know, my scheme often tells me they can't cover me because it's a non-profit scheme and we have to take care of everyone. One of the key findings of what we discuss in the report is that that's not 100% accurate, of course, because the administrator behind the scheme is a for-profit entity.
Right.
And it's paying a lot of money to executives and shareholders.
Right.
So this was a figure that really stuck with me, and I think it illustrates kind of the extent of the problem. I think in 2024, the Council for Medical Schemes found that medical aids denied about 40 billion rand in claims. So that's how much money people with medical aid had to pay in over and above their schemes. But Discovery, for example, paid out billions to shareholders in dividends that year.
Yeah.
And so I think we start to see that system that on the surface, private healthcare obviously looks a lot more glossy, and sometimes it can look more appealing, but it's a more complicated story than that. It's very inefficient. And that relentless pursuit of profit to advantage the owners often means that the quality is low, and this relentless pursuit of cutting costs, which has a real impact.
Sure. So, Michael, the obvious question throughout all of this is what needs to change about this system to stop this from happening? Because when I hear you talk about the enormous influence of $6 billionaires and multinationals and how much lobbying power they have over politicians, how much, in Ramaphosa and Motsepe's case, literally family dinner table relations that they have, I imagine that private sector, big business interests have an enormous influence over our politics. They're funding all the political parties. It's not just a matter of or at least many of the political parties, not all of them. And yet, NHI does still somehow happen. It does get through Parliament. I'm struggling to imagine how the system can change if the politics and the big business are so interwoven that our system as it exists creates oligarchs in the medical industry, in the private healthcare industry, for example, holds oligarchs, ultimately very powerful business people, over mining and health and food and whatever. What needs to change?
We probably need a longer show to discuss all the things that need to change because there's so many different aspects. I'll focus on two that I think are really important. The one you've just mentioned, which is we need to get a hold on how lobbying works, we need to regulate it better, and we also need to enforce our party funding laws. So at the moment, too many of our politicians and our political parties are getting away with only disclosing part of their funding or not disclosing at all. And that's a huge problem. The ANC currently and other parties are almost all in support of raising the threshold so we will know less about the money going into our politics, right? But party funding is more transparent than lobbying. There is currently not a single requirement in South African law at all to disclose any lobbying meetings.
It seems like such an oversight.
It's a huge oversight. So if you're Sasol, if you're the mines, you can have as many secret meetings as you want with politicians and government officials and lobby them to change the laws that would regulate them properly. Same goes for the banks. And there's no requirement on any of those parties to tell us as the public about the meetings, about what they discuss, about how it influences our lives. So it's a huge problem. The second thing we need to do, and this I think is arguably the more difficult one, is that we have to, as a public, not give up the ground of building a strong state. So the private healthcare system is a good example of this. Nearly 10 years ago, the Competition Commission looked at the private healthcare setup and they said there's too much concentration of ownership on both sides of the medical schemes and the private hospitals. We need a proper, effective regulator to regulate prices, essentially, and to make sure that healthcare is not priced ridiculously, essentially. The government just sat on that recommendation, didn't do anything, until at the last minute they kind of pushed through a kind of NHI, which, to be brutally honest, doesn't look to be the answer because they seem to ignore all of the public participation that went into the NHI. But I think, to go back to what you said in the introduction, is that the minute we as the public say, well, the state is currently so weak and riddled with corruption, so what we have to do is we just need to almost bypass it and let the private sector do what it will. We already have the evidence of what that does. And what it does is it simply entrenches this grotesquely unequal society. And so we have to somehow accept that there are serious problems within the state, deal with it where we can, but we need to rebuild institutions. We have to fix law enforcement, we have to fix the regulators, and we need to engage in a long-term project of rebuilding a state that is not just acquiescent to capital, but can stand up to it.
Just a few things then.
Yeah.
Just a short list of things we need to do. But at core, you need to force politicians to want to make these changes. You need to make it uncomfortable. You need to create political will out of necessity that if they don't do this, they will lose power. And that's why I wonder how what kind of information or education or prioritization campaign needs to go out to the whole of South Africa to say, next time you vote, think about whether the people you're voting for seem to be working to the best interests of big business, seem to be working to cover up how much money they're receiving in donations and who is giving those donations. It feels like the only possible short-term solution is a political one of South Africa's people putting political pressure on political parties to make their campaigns and campaign promises about these kinds of reforms.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, but I think that it's so difficult, partly because the information is out there, and I think the public is engaging with it on an ongoing basis. And what the difficulty is, of course, is that the levels of trust are at an all-time low.
Of course.
And so you look at a kind of across the board, whether it's the state, the private sector, civil society, the trust of the public in almost all of those institutions is low, and that's why what we've seen over time is a withdrawal from politics. Okay. Right? If you look at the electoral turnout of the last few elections, it's declined significantly. People would rather not vote. And then I think the difficulty, of course, becomes that it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem, which is that our politicians are doing themselves no favors.
But they don't have to, or haven't had to for a long time.
Haven't had to for a long time. I think the thing that would be, of course, be encouraging, which I think we should acknowledge, is that the greater electoral competition has certainly changed our politics. I think, the introduction of a government of national unity hasn't fixed a lot of problems, and it's led to a whole host of new ones. But we have started to see politicians start to realize that this is not a permanent gig.
They need to perform.
They need to perform.
Fabulous. Michael Marchant from Open Secrets, everybody. Wasn't he brilliant?